and I have to say at the beginning I am the Director of Elections for a by-election in Dublin West on the 27th of October, which we in the United Left Socialist Party are going seriously to try to take a seat there. And that means I have come much less prepared than I would normally be for a meeting, and also that I do have to leave before the end of the discussion because there's a lot of activity out there today. So you'll, my apologies for that. Now, the question, should Ireland stay in the euro? It's a very complex question, complex issue, and the way I would answer it, and all I have at this stage would be really some initial thoughts around that idea, is that in or out of the euro, on the basis of capitalism and the financial market system, there lies only a crisis upon crisis, whether it's for Ireland or for Europe, and particularly for the so-called peripheral countries in Europe at the present time. This is a question that may come on very sharply onto the agenda for Ireland in the course of the next period of years, in the context of the unsustainability of the debt that has been built up and continues to be built up by the state in terms of the banking and the sovereign debt, such as it exists at the present time. And it may arise in the context of Ireland being unable to sustain the debt, being forced into a default situation, and then either have to or essentially be forced out of the Eurozone. But I think that we get a glimpse of what can shape up for us here from what is going on in Greece at the present time, which is ahead of the curve in terms of developments in Ireland at the present time. And there's no doubt that there is discussion going on behind the scenes among the European establishment in regard to how they are going to deal with the catastrophe that is Greek capitalism at the present time. And if you take some of the statements of even leading capitalist politicians, they are hinting with regard to whether the future of Greece is outside of the Eurozone. For example, the Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte said countries which are not prepared to be placed under administratorship can choose to use the possibility to leave the Eurozone. In other words, unless you become a complete vassal and absolutely impoverish and enslave your people to pay off the financial debts of the European banks and the money markets, you will be kicked out. Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, says that threatens that if Greece does not meet the conditions set by the Troika, payments will stop. And then he says Greece has to see how it gets access to financial markets and without help from the Eurozone. That is Greece's problem. So you can see that it's being hinted at. Now, it's very possible that, and I think that this is the case here, that they are more making these statements to threaten Greece, to threaten the government and the Greek establishment, that they must absolutely fall into line, because if any country leaves the Eurozone, it would be a huge blow to the prestige of the European bourgeois and their political project. Because the euro has been, the euro is obviously, and the Eurozone is a huge part of the architecture that the capitalist class in Europe, the leaders of European capitalism in Greece and France, etc., have set out in terms of going into the future. And as we pointed out, for example, in the course of the Lisbon Treaty campaign and other campaigns, the strategy of the European capitalists was to try to build a major political entity as well as an economic entity that on the world stage can vie and rival the United States in particular, China and other countries as well. And the Eurozone having a common currency would obviously be an important part of that strategy. So it would be a huge crisis for them and a huge blow to the prestige of the European capitalist establishment if one or more countries was forced out. Not to mention, of course, the absolute chaos and crisis it would cause within the financial system itself in Europe and worldwide, because of course it would only happen that a country would leave or be forced out on the basis of a default, means not being able to pay the massive loans, and those loans of course are to German and French and British and other European and indeed world banks, which would cause a huge crisis inside the financial system. Now, as we know, Greece is suffering from savagely imposed austerity measures at the present time. What is happening to the Greek working class, the pensioners and the poor, is absolutely criminal. But it is hardly publicised or commented on in our media here, and in European media. It is really just the headlines of the crisis from the financial markets perspective. But what is happening to the Greek working class and poor is quite breathtaking in terms of the savage cuts in their living standards, in life itself in Greece at the present time. And of course, as we on the left have pointed out for a very long time, austerity, which is supposedly to allow Greece to pay back its debts, is in fact making it more difficult for those debts to be paid back. Because, and the same is absolutely true here, if you savage the living standards of middle and low income workers, then the economy collapses. So therefore the taxes and the surplus that would be needed to pay back the debts is not being, are not being created. And that's exactly what is happening, has happened in Greece. And by the way, is what's going to happen, or is happening here, but will happen here as well, with the increased velocity in the few years ahead. Now the reality is that the Greek debt is simply unsustainable. It's just impossible for the Greek working class, for the Greek people to pay off this debt, and therefore inevitably the question is, what does Greece do? And then does Greece leave the Eurozone or stay into the Eurozone? Now there's a capitalist economist called Nouriel Roubini, but one of the more far-seeing of that ilk, who has been correct on many of the issues. He argues that an orderly default and exit from the Euro, although inevitably imposing extreme hardship on the Greek working class for a period, would be preferable to the slow, disorderly implosion of the Greek economy and society. And then he goes on to argue that there should be international coordinated action to recapitalise the banks and financial institutions that will suffer loss on the Greek loans. Now, in theory, an approach along these lines based on a coordinated international intervention to mitigate the problem of unsustainable debt in Greece would be preferable to blundering into an explosive collapse of the Greek economy and all the uncontrolled repercussions that would result from that. However, the capitalist markets do not function in an orderly, rational and coherent way. And the idea of Greece defaulting and then leaving you will just send the capitalist financial markets into a tailspin of uncontrolled crisis. Now, even if Greece leaves, and every time I say Greece, think Ireland, the point is that a default on the debt, and we argue for non-payment here in Ireland. We shouldn't pay, and the Greek working class shouldn't pay these debts that were accumulated by their own capitalist class, the major bankers, the gamblers, the property bubbles, etc. But a default and exit from the Eurozone would not in themselves provide a solution for the economy or for the working people for the majority of Greece. As in Argentina in 1999-2002, the Greek ruling class would attempt to put the burden of the crisis onto the shoulders of working people, exactly as is happening at the present time. What would happen is they would have to go back to the drachma, but the drachma would be hugely devalued. That means that the debts owed by banks, by businesses, by the sovereign, etc., would be massively increased and even more unsustainable, and that they would shut Greece out from the international financial markets. So you would have a massive crisis inside Greece of no liquidity for small businesses, for banks, etc., etc., and a situation like Argentina 10 years ago. Now, therefore, what that, meanwhile staying within, is, as we see the crisis that we have here, and as in Greece. So what is the solution? And what we in the Socialist Party would say, that really within or without the euro, on the basis of capitalism, there is no solution. That's the key point. And we can envisage a solution only on the basis of a left and a socialist alternative, which means that the major financial institutions, the big banks, the hedge funds, etc., the financial markets, in other words, must be brought into public ownership under democratic control and management of the majority in society, not to bail them out in the crude way that is happening and has happened in recent years, but in a positive, proactive way, and then use those institutions in order to invest in society. Invest, for example, in this country in the context of huge public investment in major infrastructure, because you would have to take emergency measures to put tens of thousands of people back to work in order to generate and regenerate economic activity, to bring society from the hole that it is in at the present time. So therefore, we, certainly in the Socialist Party, don't see a solution to this on the basis of saying, let's leave the euro and be kind of outside the eurozone. Inside or outside, in Ireland as well, in the course of the next years, it will be crisis upon crisis on the basis of the rules and the laws and the logic of capitalism. And lastly, I mean, the whole crisis at the present time, society, the majority in society, people generally, ordinary people, must be learning lessons with regard to how insane the present financial structures are. Despite the best efforts of the media, including scandalously the publicly owned and run media like RTE, to cover up the truth and the reality of the system. I listen to Morning Ireland every morning. It's the programme on RTE radio. Everybody probably knows it. I mean, for 3 years, I am so heartily sick of the questions that are asked week in, week out, economists and commentators who come and are asked to comment on the latest government cut or the budget cut, etc. And the question is, after every new cut to the living standards of our people, to the public spending, is, will this satisfy the markets? Will the markets be reassured? Is this enough to give confidence to the markets? Never ever. Well, who are these markets that are going crazy, that are dictating, that are speculating against Italy and Spain and country after country, undermining currencies, undermining societies in order to make a massive killing in a short time? Never. Who are they? Unelected, unaccountable, faceless. Isn't this the first question that should be asked? The dictatorship of the markets. And they are very uncomfortable, the establishment here. I posed that to, what's his name, Barroso in the European Parliament once, and he just went ape. And you pose it here to Enda Kenny. Enda doesn't understand the question sufficiently to go ape, so he just tries to answer in some other way. But the question is, we're supposed to live in a democratic Europe. They've lectured me for the months I was there, or 2 years I was there, on this wonderful zone of democracy and so on. a democracy that is dictated to by the major hedge fund operators, gamblers and speculators in the financial markets. But I think that will become increasingly clear to our people over the next period of time, and therefore the idea of an alternative to that, which is democratic socialism as we would understand it, that is the only solution. And I think there will be an increasing audience and support for those ideas as the crisis unfolds and shows people the nature of the system and the fact that there is no solution on the basis of the present setup.
Thanks, Joe.
Go am go Joe an chaint bra sin agus anis gléim Frank Keoghan og Lucia on Fubble. Frank Keoghan from Chair of People's Movement to give his contribution.
I'm going to stand up here because I'm small, I suppose.
The box.
I need a soapbox. When I was younger, a lot younger than I am now, it's a long time ago in other words, Alan Dukes, who is now the chairman of the notorious Anglo-Irish Bank, campaigning for a yes to Maastricht, intoned that the principal reason why Ireland's membership of the Eurozone would be advantageous to ordinary people would be that we wouldn't have to bother much about currency exchange, bother at all in fact, when we went on holiday in or traded with other Eurozone countries. But he ignored the major disadvantages, which briefly are that the rate of interest or cost of credit is decided for the benefit of the Eurozone as a whole and not by the needs of our economy. And secondly, that the rate of exchange of the euro via other currencies is decided in a similar manner. And finally, as long as Northern Ireland remains with sterling, our continuing membership of the Eurozone, especially if it were to move towards a fiscal as well as a monetary union, which indications are that it is, would add a profoundly new dimension to partition. The Eurozone is flawed for at least three main reasons. In the first instance, it was set up as a political device, and we heard this last night, to reconcile France to German reunification in 1989. And many economists do not regard the Eurozone as an optimum currency area, able to sustain its own currency indefinitely. The Eurozone is incapable of maintaining one currency, interest rate policy and exchange rate policy for economies that have different levels of productivity and implicit economic competitiveness, different resource endowments, different degrees of exposure to economic shocks. It has prevented Eurozone deficit countries from protecting themselves against exports from stronger, more robust economies by robbing them of the ability to devalue their currencies. And finally, our recent history has shown that it puts countries like Ireland under the rule of the ECB, whose policy is to prevent insolvent private banks going bust anywhere in the Eurozone, and which insisted that we keep Anglo-Irish afloat at horrendous cost to the people of this state, horrendous ongoing cost. So a political stance that advocates struggle to achieve an independent Irish state with an independent currency, and with that control over the interest rate or exchange rate, the most fundamental tools of economic policy, is not a matter of sentimental nationalism, but to me makes economic common sense. Joining the EMU deprived us of the ability to maintain our competitiveness by adopting an exchange rate or interest rate that will enable us to balance our payments, and it fails to compensate us for that loss by the automatic transfer of resources from the centre. The treaties require all EU member states to join the Eurozone, except Britain and Denmark, which negotiated legal opt-outs under the Maastricht Treaty. The Swedish people were an exception. They rejected joining the single currency in 2003 by 56% to 42%, and in 2010, magically, Sweden's growth rate was the highest in the EU. As Europe's biggest exporter of manufactured goods, Germany gains big economic advantages from EMU. Weaker EMU members can no longer use currency devaluation to defend themselves against German imports, while its trade surpluses are largely recycled to the peripherals. Outside EMU, the German mark would soar, while the peripheral countries' currencies would fall. But Germany, with its high rate of savings, relatively low wages, and balance of payment surplus, is unwilling to expand its domestic demand to stimulate employment in the Eurozone's deficit economies. In Europe, the result of this situation is the sovereign debt crisis. There are three ways out, really. First one, debts are paid off out of real economic growth. It's really an impossibility, Joe has mentioned this, in the context of austerity regimes which the EU insists on for peripheral Eurozone countries. The second one is the debts are inflated away in the classic way, you print money. Or the third one, they could be written down by peripheral members actually leaving the Eurozone. The value of having one's currency was shown for Ireland in the period 1993 to 1999, when the currency markets forced the Irish elite to abandon the fixed exchange rate that was part of the EU's exchange rate mechanism. Most of you are probably not old enough to remember that, but I remember it pretty well. Maybe you do as well, Joe. This 7-year period was the only time in the history of the Irish state when it in effect floated its currency, giving the Irish economy a highly competitive exchange rate. This boosted Irish exports, inhibited competitive imports, and launched the country on over a decade of exceptional economic growth. For over 60 years, the Irish pound was pegged at par with sterling, giving Ireland an implicitly overvalued currency which reduced competitiveness and inhibited economic growth and employment, as succinctly outlined in Conor McCabe's recent book, Sins of the Father, or Fathers. In 1979, Ireland broke the link with sterling but tied its currency to the Deutschmark in the EMS in preparation for EMU. But when Britain devalued in September 1992, Ireland stayed with the Deutschmark, so that by January 1993, the Irish pound was worth £1.10 sterling. But this was ruining our trade, which was mostly at that time with Britain and the USA. So this forced the Irish government to devalue the Irish pound by 10% in January 1993. The Irish pound floated downward for the rest of the 1990s, and it was £90 sterling approximately when we adopted the euro in 1999. And then there was banking. As late as the end of 1997, almost 90% of all Irish banks' lending was financed by Irish deposits, while property-based lending made up less than 1/3 of the loan books of Irish banks. That was in 1997. Irish bank customers could borrow foreign currency all right, but as the borrower carried the exchange rate risk, such loans were, well, expensive and rare. Our membership of the euro removed this de facto cap on Irish bank lending. Irish banks could borrow from other Eurozone banks without any exchange rate risk, and the cost of borrowing actually halved as Irish interest rates converged on German rates during 1998. This combination of a massive increase in the availability of credit and a halving of interest rates was the harbinger of economic disaster. By the end of 2007, that's only 10 years later, very short time, Irish bank lending was almost 7 times greater than it had been a decade earlier, while deposits had only tripled. It doesn't hang together. This means that the proportion of Irish bank lending financed by Irish bank deposits fell to less than 45%. A binge. If we had opted to stay out of the euro in 1999, it's likely that the Irish pound, would, like sterling and the dollar, have initially risen against the euro, while our interest rates would also have stayed higher than those in the Eurozone. In 1999, the Republic did roughly 1/3 of its total trade with the Eurozone, 1/3 with the UK, and 1/3 with the USA and the rest of the world. In 1973, when we joined the EEC, this is an amazing figure when I found it, 55% of total Irish exports went to the UK. In 2009, remember, 55% went to the UK when we joined the EEC. In 2009, 53% of exports from Irish-owned firms went to the UK. That's a really intriguing figure, given all the guff about trading with the EU. In 2008, proportion for total trade had changed somewhat significantly, mainly because of the presence of multinationals, I would argue, in that we traded 34% with the Eurozone, up about 2 or 3% since we joined. Our overall trade, total trade with the UK, went down, however, to 24%, and our trade with the rest of the world went up significantly to 42%. So that's the myth of our trade with the Eurozone, significantly dealt with. These are all official figures. I didn't make up any of them. They're quite shocking when you look at them. In 1993, devaluation gave Ireland a very highly competitive exchange rate. Its growth rate almost doubled to 6% in 1993, the year of devaluation, averaging 8 to 9% a year from then until 1999, when Ireland joined the Eurozone. Eurozone interest rates were then low to suit Germany and France, which were in recession in early 2000s. But Ireland was experiencing a boom and needed higher interest rates to dampen demand. Instead, Ireland effectively halved its nominal interest rate in joining the EU. This led to a borrowing binge, and I think you know the rest of it. A sharp internal division, however, was emerging between the EU core and periphery, reflected in progressive loss of competitiveness by the periphery relative to the core, which has benefited from extraordinary pressure on workers' wages. In Germany, this has meant practically stagnant real wages. And those who heard Fabio De Masi here a few weeks ago would have a fair handle on that. His argument was that real wages for German workers had actually decreased by 5% over the period since 1989. Loss of competitiveness has entailed systematic current account deficits for the periphery, mirrored by equally systematic surpluses for Germany. The alternative of exit from the Eurozone is the great unmentionable in peripheral EU countries such as Ireland. There is no doubt that it would have severe consequences for us, but it is notable that a number of influential economists continue to raise the issue in the media. It is an indictment of our political system that there is no rational debate about possible default scenarios that could arise out of the present ongoing crisis, a point made by Joe. For example, the effects of a default by Greece and its exit from the euro. There is a duty incumbent on democratic and progressive forces to be preparing for such an eventuality, yet the silence from these quarters mirrors that of the mainstream. During the recent difficulties, there have been proposals to introduce the Greek drachma for domestic purposes, which would in practice result in devaluation, coupled with a short holiday for Greece from the Eurozone, returning at a lower rate of exchange. The underlying logic of these proposals is clear. The problems originate in loss of competitiveness. And discussion of this issue in Ireland has been dominated by right-wing thinking, and the government's intent, backed by the EU, ECB, IMF, is to achieve a devaluation of wages across the economy in order to restore competitiveness. But where are the progressive voices making the obvious point that this objective could be tackled through currency devaluation, which would be much more equitable, as it would reduce living standards for everybody, not just workers or the vulnerable? I refer to these suggestions as conservative exit. Conservative exit would operate as a complement to the EU IMF austerity package and the six-pack about to be imposed by the EU Commission by allowing for devaluation, which is currently impossible. With regard to that six-pack, I just found a quote, which I hadn't the time to put into this, from Mr. Barroso, who said, "What is going on is a silent revolution in terms of stronger economic governance by small steps. The Member States have accepted, and I hope they understood it exactly, but they have accepted very important powers of the European institutions regarding surveillance and a much stricter control of public finances." The European Parliament passed that six-pack last week, and I read a statement from your MEP, Joe, on that issue. Good statement, I would say. So that's what I see as conservative exit. Devaluation would have costs for workers, since real wages would fall to the degree to which imports enter the wage basket. But there would also be costs for sectors of capital, particularly those servicing debt abroad, including corporations and banks. Cessation of payments and restructuring of international debt would have to be pursued. A lengthening of the present adjustment period beyond the target date of 2014 would be less likely to produce a deflationary shock, exacerbated by increased unemployment, as government expenditure would not be so severely curtailed. But conservative exit would not of itself deal with the longer-term challenge of raising productivity growth and altering deficient economic structures. It would immediately change the terms of trade, encouraging production of exports. Whether or not Irish capital will be able to grasp this opportunity to restructure indigenous production, expand investment and develop new fields of activity is open to question. The free market in Ireland would have to generate an uncharacteristic burst of productive dynamism. The task is complicated because peripheral countries typically have productive structures of intermediate technology, while as in Ireland, real wages are above those of competitors in Asia and elsewhere. There is a risk, therefore, that conservative exit, coupled with liberalisation, would lead to protracted stagnation accompanied by bouts of inflation, successive devaluations and slow erosion of workers' income. Central to the credo of Ireland's ruling elite, in common with the elites of other peripheral states, is remaining within the Eurozone and shifting costs onto working people. This leaves the option of progressive exit. That is an exit conditional on radical restructuring of the economy and society. Default and exit from the Eurozone have very serious implications, but these must be weighted against serious implications of continued recession and stagnation. One thing is clear, Exit requires a radical political and social alliance, alliances which do not exist in Ireland at present other than in potential form. It would be far from easy to make them real, particularly as shifting the balance of power in favour of Labour is predicated upon democratic organisation of the economy and society. But there is no reason to believe that if a credible political force proposed it, that it would be impossible for Progressive Exit to win broad support. Restructuring of debt would be necessary. Debtor-led, that's Irish state repudiation of the debt, would mean unilateral suspension of payments, an implied threat of 100% burning of the bondholders. There would have to be an independent public audit of debt following suspension of payments and fair and transparent arbitration. And some of you may know that in 2008, in November 2008, Ecuador became the first country to undertake examination of the legitimacy and structure of its foreign debt. Very successfully did so. Ecuador's use of legitimacy as a legal argument for defaulting set a major precedent. Indeed, the formation of a debt auditing commission sets a precedent in identifying illegitimate or odious debt. Subsequently, in June 2009, Ecuador reached agreement with 91% of its creditors to buy back its debt for 35 cents on the dollar. That was a good strong haircut, as they might say. And we have had in recent times a report commissioned by, among others, Unite and AFRI, and I would recommend that to you, and maybe we can talk about it later, looking at the Irish debt audit. Following Progressive Exit, access to international capital markets will become extremely difficult. There's no point in saying it wouldn't. Banks will come under heavy pressure, facing bankruptcy, but a sustained path to growth could be achieved provided there was serious economic and social transformation. In Progressive Exit, there's absolutely no point in talking about it unless economic and social transformation accompanies it. These measures will represent a challenge to the EU institutions, but will also represent a challenge to workers' organisations who have consistently espoused the rhetoric of social Europe within Ireland and the EU. And we heard some of it last night. Some strategic steps are clear. Default and exit would certainly create problems in public finances, but these will be ameliorated as recovery began following default. The government could also borrow from the state banking system, as well as monetising the deficit to a certain extent by issuing government securities or notes. But clearly, government deficit would have to be addressed through strict spending targets while preserving social priorities. The difference is, of course, that the government will be able to prioritise things in the interests of the Irish people, rather than what we have at the moment, faced as people coming in and telling them how they should prioritise and what they should put and what they shouldn't put. And of course, you know who gets hit. Repudiation of the debt would run the risk of precipitating a banking crisis, since substantial volumes of public debt are held by domestic banks. To protect the banking system, it would be necessary to engage in nationalisation, creating a system of state banks. This would guarantee deposits, especially those of small savers. It would also facilitate the advance of credit on reasonable terms to small and medium enterprises, thus protecting employment. These banks will contribute to attaining sustained growth, as well as beginning to reverse the financialisation of the economy. Capital controls would also be necessary, in the first instance to prevent the outflow of liquid funds and protect... Okay. And protect... Hurry up. I'll tell you what, I'll stop now and then I'll finish it after you're gone. And protect the banking system to marshal national resources. I once worked in a place and I used to teach. See, now what you started, you see? And they used to release guys from work so I could teach them things. And then I was taking the period didn't suit the managers on the floor, and they said, well, you better talk faster so we can get the guys back to work quicker. So there you are. Thanks, Joe, for reminding me of that horrible experience. All state guarantees and interbank lending would have to be lifted, although the state could still guarantee deposits in the new currency. Investors who invest in Irish government bonds will be burned, being paid back in the new currency, which would find its own value. As the central bank would do what the US, Britain, Canada and Sweden are now doing, and print money, the liquidity trap that we would be in would evaporate. And I want to say that to Jack O'Connor because he was making a big thing out of the liquidity trap. Well, anyway, clearly inflation would rise and the state would need to introduce CPI-linked bonds to refinance itself, as Sweden and Finland have successfully done. Unemployment would fall rapidly, as it has done in practically every country which has embarked on such a policy. The Asian Tigers collapse in 1997 is an example of this rapid re-employment phenomenon. But there are other problems in terms of fairness. Young people with debts would benefit, immensely. Middle-aged people with assets and pensioners would lose out. But as most of the value of these assets will be wiped out in the grinding recession the next few years will bring, if we continue to where we're going, over a 5-year period there might be little net difference. The combination of public banking and controls over capital account would immediately pose the question of public ownership over other areas of the economy. Underlying competitive weakness already threatened the viability of entire areas of economic activity in Ireland. Public ownership of specific sectors will be necessary to prevent collapse. Public utilities, transport, energy and telecommunications will be prime candidates, at the very least, in order to support the rest of economic activity. With significant areas of economic activity under public ownership and control, the rest of the economy could be shifted onto a different growth path governed through the introduction of industrial policy. And it's notable that public institutions and mechanisms for promoting development, which have been steadily abolished in the years since the Maastricht Treaty, would have to be rebuilt on a new basis. This is not a policy of isolationism. It would be necessary to maintain access to international trade, particularly within the EU, just like it would also be necessary to seek technology transfer and capital from abroad. There is growth potential in Ireland in areas of clean energy production and efficiencies, as well as improved water quality / delivery, natural resource development and waste disposal. There's also a scope for public investment in housing provision, urban planning, roads and railways. But there is finally the more difficult task of improving technology as well as research and development in an area in which we are woefully deficient. Structural change also requires transforming education by committing additional resources and expanding its reach to the poorest. Presently, Ireland ranks 30th out of 34 OECD countries in terms of education expenditure as a percentage of GDP. 30th out of 34 in the OECD. It's apparent that structural change of this order could hardly be undertaken using the present inefficient and corrupt mechanisms of the Irish state. Broad political and social alliances are necessary to rebuild the structures of state on the basis of grassroots control, transparency and accountability. Support for real wages could be provided through the policy of income redistribution, effected through a restructuring of the tax base. Pressure on workers could be reduced in the long term if food, rents, building costs and services such as gas and electricity were subjected to price control. Transfer payments would also be used directly to tackle inequality in peripheral areas and regions. The Irish economy is resource rich, possessing rich farming land, extensive seas, oil, gas and a range of minerals, and becoming an immediate beneficiary from primary commodity exports if either resources were taken into state ownership or taxed realistically. No more licences for resource exploration will be issued and a state exploration company could be set up. Discoveries could then be exploited by the government on behalf of the people, utilising what remains of the National Pension Reserve Fund or in cooperation with countries possessing expertise. And I've long argued for a land value tax, and you can imagine I put that in as well. What should we be doing now? We should immediately begin negotiation with other peripheral countries that are experiencing difficulties in order to explore the possibilities for joint coordinated action. In our natural hinterland, Britain, Denmark, Sweden and Norway are non-Eurozone members and so a natural trading bloc, and we should now concentrate on expanding our trade with these countries. On the tax front, several of the highest earners in Ireland pay no tax whatsoever. We've over 19,000 millionaires, and over 1,000 people with incomes over 100,000 a year pay less than 5% tax. These aren't tax exiles, they actually live in Ireland. The only way to recover this money is through an assets tax, which is common in several countries, France, Norway and Switzerland for example. If the 320 billion in assets held by the top 5%, 320 billion in assets held by the top 5% attracted a 2% annual assets tax, we would bring in, amazing, 6 billion a year. 6 billion a year. That's only a 2% asset tax on the top 5%. To put this in context, as part of the deal negotiated with the Troika, the government has committed to a combination of tax increases and public spending cuts, and we know how serious they're going to be, presently totalling, and may go as far as 4 billion, but presently totalling 3.6 billion in 2012. Peripheral countries such as Ireland are currently confronted with stark choices because of the crisis and the structural weaknesses of the Eurozone. The current crisis has been resolved through austerity measures to serve the interests of the social classes that created the disaster in the first place. It's inequitable, imposing huge costs on working people who are not to blame for the upheaval, and it's all to save the euro. There would be costs to any form of radical strategy, but unlike the option of austerity, radical change would have the potential to put the economy on a sustainable path of development that would produce benefits for all. The choice belongs to society, and as always, of course, depends on struggle. We could acquiesce in unending austerity, remaining within the Eurozone and putting up with recession or stagnation for the indefinite future. If austerity fails and EU creditor-led restructuring does not produce decisive results, the option of debtor-led default, that's Irish in our case, led default, would occur for Ireland, but in the midst of social and economic chaos caused by false austerity. So my answer is to leave the euro, reinstate our own currency, allow it to fall to reflect the real competitive position of our ruined economy and start again. The vast majority of economists and commentators said this is not possible, but these are the same people who believed in the soft landing mantra for years. Leaving the euro would be radical and challenging. The consequences would have to be balanced against the decades of austerity promised by continued membership. Only last week the Commission said that austerity will continue to be demanded into the foreseeable future, not just from Ireland but from all EU countries. I don't know about you, but I prefer to live in a country that gives itself a chance than in one where current policies can only lead to slow strangulation. But there are no easy, painless answers to Ireland's crisis, whichever way one looks at it. Nevertheless, I believe that on balance, exit from the euro will be to our advantage, and that we should begin the debate now and not leave the issue to be decided behind closed doors by a few people in the way the destructive bank bailout was decided, allegedly, in somebody's kitchen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank, for that very detailed contribution. Both speakers have given, I think, the indication that there is not a simplistic answer to the question posed this morning, and that the complications of structural weaknesses in the Irish economy and its relations with international business leads to more careful consideration of what can be done. And I think both have indicated also that indigenous resources have the potential for further development for the benefit of the people living on this island, rather than profit takers from outside, as we suffer from more than maybe other European countries because of previous governments' obsession with obtaining foreign capital investment here and neglecting to a great extent the development of indigenous resources such as our agriculture and fisheries. And we know from experience, and everybody knows, that the decline of the Irish fishing industry and the potential that had in the 1970s and 80s, and our Irish agriculture, with food shortage being one of the big problems of the next 50 years, we have the potential here for more production, and it should be in the hands of people living here and the workers who actually produce this wealth. So in opening up the question to the audience, I'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and since Joe is time constrained and has to leave, if you want to ask questions specifically to Joe, you need to do it now, this first option. So who wants to go first? Okay. You can ask.
Joe, you mentioned your exit is not a solution in itself, and then you mentioned Argentina. Argentina was pegged to the dollar. And last year, Argentina was the fastest growing economy in South America, 7.5% growth. And it's because it exited itself from the peg to the dollar. It released itself from its own Eurozone crisis and towards independence. And I think, doesn't that show a way forward for Ireland by following that example? And also, isn't it the case that locked in the euro, a socialist development that we talk about, as is obviously desirable, would be fundamentally illegal and run counter to not only euro rules but EU rules on state aid and so on.
Any other question?
Thank you. It's Donald Milan. Just more of a comment than a question. I just think that looking across the board at what's happening to Greece at present and the reaction of the ruling classes across Europe in terms of the hint of them being forced out of the euro, it's linked very much, in my view, to the question of default, i.e. a country defaults or is talking about defaulting, and the next thing the issue of getting out of the euro becomes apparent. I think that should be a relationship that the left should look at very closely, and I think there's an example which we should certainly examine intensively, and that is much closer than in America. It's Iceland. Never has been in the euro, but has defaulted, and I think we should, as a group and groupings, examine precisely how they've come on, and I'd argue that they've come on extremely well, having defaulted and having grasped the particular nettle, and it's just that area that I think the question of exiting from the euro and defaulting, they're intrinsically linked in my view. Thank you.
Any more before I go to the speakers? No. Okay then, well the suggestion seems to be we should examine the default situations, one in Argentina and one in Ireland, in comparison with the situation in Greece and what Ireland could do. I would just say, as a comment, Argentina is a massive country with huge agricultural resources, a technological base, developed infrastructure, more than any other country in Latin America. So it had a good base to go on with in doing what it did. Iceland, a very small country with less than half the population of the city that we're in, but has modest resources as regards fisheries and tourism. So both interesting things. So I put it to the speakers now for their reply. Who wants to go? Joe?
Well, I think Frank mentioned the straitjacket that the euro meant, and the left, before the euro, long before it, was absolutely right in our analysis of what would happen. And it was just a pipe dream to think that weak capitalist economies like Portugal or Greece or Ireland, despite the delusions of grandeur that developed in this country in the 90s and early 2000s, could compete with giants like Germany. And it was inevitable. And Frank was right, the flexibility that existed to devalue was a weapon that was open to the weaker capitalist countries and their ruling economic and political elites to try and maneuver themselves out of a position, out of a crisis. And that is going to continue to be a massive contradiction inside of the Eurozone, which can result, as we were indicating, in countries being forced out or leaving. Now, in relation to Argentina, I don't think you can just take the headline growth rates as, you know, the guide or a statement of everything. I mean, the fact is, what happened in Argentina imposed savage suffering on the middle income and lower income workers and the poor. Savage and incredible. I mean, the growth rates in exports here, for example, is quite massive, but it has very little impact on the real problems, for example, mass unemployment, because it's the domestic economy that is suffering so acutely from austerity. Now, I think Frank's, in relation to Argentina and Ecuador that Frank mentioned, I mean, both do show that it is not simply a blanket situation that when you default, that then you're shut out of the markets, insofar as you have to go into the capitalist markets for funding for all time. I mean, Argentina has worked its way back in, but with a big cost. Ecuador, Frank mentioned. Where I would differ with Frank, I suppose, is this, that Frank seems to be indicating, if you like, that on the basis of capitalism, which means private ownership of the major sectors of the economy essentially, that it would be possible to leave the euro and to develop. I don't think that they can develop the economy. And Frank himself mentions, which we agree fully with, that really it does imply in many senses public ownership of the financial institutions. And I would say proactively, public ownership of the financial institutions and other major sectors of the economy, so that you can democratically plan your production and development. In my view, that is really the only way that we can develop our society arising out of the present crisis. But I think that Frank mentioned another interesting point, which I've put forward many times as well. Is this? It is really